John Sloan III. He's the co-lead organizer for the Black Lives Matter Detroit chapter. John, thanks so much for being with us on the MegaCast. It's nice to have you.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
So tell us, what is the purpose? Black Lives Matter is in the news so much right now. What is the purpose? I think sometimes the message can get lost. So we want to hear it from you. What's the purpose? What do you want to accomplish? And is it working?
Well, I think my answer to that last part, is it working, is probably a longer answer. What's the purpose? The purpose is to proclaim very loudly that for a long period of time, in fact, for the entire duration of our country's existence, the lives of all citizens of this country have not been treated with equity, have not been valued equally. And in fact, that the system within which we currently live, while there are some amazing parts of this country that I'm sure we all love and we all appreciate, the system in which we all live was built upon a foundation of inherent racism. And that Black lives, Black bodies have been criminalized, have been devalued. And so when we say Black Lives Matter, that is our effort to draw attention to that fact and to rally around a desire and a goal of achieving equity for Black people and for the most marginalized among us.
We've seen protests throughout the country. How do we take the protest a step further to make it a part of policy?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I think a lot of community organizations are already doing that work. So BLM Detroit, as an example, started working, I would say, about 3 months ago. In the very recent aftermath of George Floyd's murder, with a coalition of other community organizations, including BYP, Black Youth Project, the Detroit Justice Center, and a host of other organizations inside the city of Detroit, and two Detroit council members, Council Member Raquel Castaneda Lopez and President Pro Tem Barry Sheffield. And we presented 2 weeks ago to the city a Detroiters' Bill of Rights. And the goal with that Bill of Rights is the same as the Bill of Rights to our own United States Constitution. It's to ensure and enshrine in the city's charter certain protections for all of our citizens. And so a lot of community organizations you're going to find are doing work just like this. We're doing advocacy work, on a regular basis, programmatic work on a regular basis. The protests themselves are extremely useful because they continue to focus attention on these issues. And I'm sure as you understand, being the media, the unfortunate reality is that without this continual attention, some of these important issues can lose steam and can lose momentum. So we appreciate, on one side, the energy that these protests provide. And on the other side, we're able to take that energy and that pressure and translate that and leverage that into real, actual policy initiatives and legislative change.
John Sloan III with us. He's the co-lead organizer of Black Lives Matter Detroit with us on the Oakland County MegaCast. And John, when you were explaining the overarching purpose of the Black Lives Matter movement, you mentioned equity and equality in the same description, but there is a major difference, and one is being sought after and one is being talked about. What is the difference between seeking equity and understanding equality as it pertains to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Sure. So the short answer is that equal means that people are given the same thing. Equitable means that people are given the resources to reach the same goal, even if they're starting from different places. The illustration that you'll see often is that you have two individuals that want to reach something off of the shelf, right? One person is 4'10", the other person is 6'3". If you give both of them a 3-foot step stool, that's equal treatment. You're giving them each the same thing. But the taller person can get there. The shorter person still can't. So the equitable thing to do is to give the taller person the step stool and the shorter person a 6-foot ladder, because that means they can start from different places and reach the same goal. Equality was not a part of our Constitution. And that all you have to do is read it, right? The 3/5 compromise is an excellent example of the lack of equality in our Constitution and in our system. Equity is what we need as a result of that inherent lack of equality in the beginning. Because what's happened is as time has gone on, that line has grown, the gap has grown. And you can talk about that when it comes to issues of race, gender equity, sexual orientation, when you talk about issues of classism, All those things become really important in understanding the real intersectionality of systemic bias and how all these forces continue to oppress the most marginalized people that live at those intersections.
We are speaking with John Sloan III. You are the co-leader, organizer of the Black Lives Matter Detroit. We've seen a lot of protests. And Detroit, you've actually had a lot of peaceful protests, but we've seen throughout the country where they turn violent, looting, stealing. I know that a lot of law enforcement is saying that it's people coming in to like your organization that aren't a part of your organization trying to stir up trouble, and they're behind some of these issues that's been going on. How do you watch who is in your protest? I mean, you really can't. I would imagine it's hard to tell if someone is a part of your movement or not, or just there to cause trouble. And do you think it's taking away from your message?
So there's an underlying premise to your question that I want to respond to before I get to the end of your question, which is that a lot of the violence that we have seen in these protest actions, obviously I haven't been to every single protest action across the country, right? So I can only speak to ones with which I have a close knowledge or have friends or colleagues and comrades that have been at those actions. But a lot of that violence comes about because of the energy with which protesters are being met by police forces. And you could see some of that happen in Detroit with protesters being met with riot gear and rubber bullets and tear gas without a precipitation of violence in advance. And so I just want to be clear that a lot of the violence that you're seeing comes from both sides, if I'm being blunt and honest about it. But you're right. There have been interlopers that have made their efforts to insinuate themselves into different chapters of other organizations, whether it's with BLM Detroit or Detroit Will Breathe, which is another great organization here in the city, or with other organizations and other chapters of BLM across the country. I think generally speaking, as somebody that's done protest actions, that's worked in different capacities as an organizer and as an activist, you can understand pretty quickly whether or not somebody is there for pure intentions or not, right? And you can, the more you interact with somebody and the more you get out in the streets and the more you focus on doing the work, the easier it is to understand who's there just to kind of cause some chaos and who is there to be an active and integral part of progression. And in those moments, it's incumbent upon all of us to stay aware. And what you'll notice, so I'm being really clear, the official chapter of Black Lives Matter Detroit has not organized any of the protests that you have seen in Detroit since George Floyd's murder. That is not to say we have not endorsed them or participated in them, but we've been very acutely aware of the effects of COVID on the Black and brown communities, especially in Detroit. And so we've been opting for virtual events and programmatic action instead of direct action. That being said, we have been out and we have seen how these actions and these marches have taken place. And generally speaking, you see a lot of the same people, you know a lot of the same organizers and activists that are out there. And it's easier for us, I think, when you're in the middle of it, to be able to spot those interlopers, those individuals that are really just out there to discredit and cause chaos.
I'm an advocate for Detroit. I worked in the city closely for years. One of the things that I've heard from some Detroiters that I know is that they feel like some of the protesters are coming from outside of the city. They're from the suburbs. They don't really know or understand their day-to-day life and what they're facing, and they're not being brought into the conversation. Do you want the people who are from the suburbs, should they be interacting more with Detroiters to help understand so that you can move your movement forward and actually you're there to help the people of the city?
Yeah, so we are actually here to help people, right? Like we're based in Detroit, Michigan, but that's not to say that if somebody, and this has happened a lot, if somebody comes to us from Southfield or Traverse City, that they don't have an equal claim to wanting their Blackness validated and seen and recognized. Metro Detroit, Southeastern Michigan in specific, we're an interesting area, right? Like I traveled a lot in the first part of my life, in my 20s, into my career, and the segregation that exists in Wayne, Oakland, Macomb counties, and the frequency with which people cross those county lines, I think, creates an interesting dynamic in southeastern Michigan. Detroiters, at the end of the day, should be in charge of Detroit, should be in charge of their fate, of their policy initiatives, of their legislature, of their budget. Participatory budgeting is something that we're really advocating for, as an example. That does not mean, however, that somebody from Southfield or Farmington or Troy cannot be a part of the conversation. But it's all about, it's about how you enter into that conversation and the presence with which you mind yourself as you're entering into somebody else's community, and understanding that all of these are individual communities, right? So I wouldn't drive to Lake Orion, as an example, which is a city that I don't live in, that I've never lived in, and start initially inserting myself into that conversation without A, being invited, or B, taking the opportunity to learn how the issues happening in that municipality affect me and ripple out. And so I think part of the frustration you feel is when people that aren't Detroit proper residents come into the city and initially insinuate themselves with aggression and without cognizance of how their presence is going to affect the larger conversation and the residents of that city proper. But that's not to say that we don't welcome participation. It's just to say that we ask people do it with a critical mind about how their presence is going to affect the broader goals.
John, on the topic of participatory budgeting, there's been calls throughout the country for, as it's quoted, defunding the police. And I think a lot of times that terminology gets lost in a very literal take on the terminology defunding the police. When those calls are being made, clarify for those that may not understand, what does that mean in the broad sense, and what does the people involved in the Black Lives Matter movement and those that are seeking equity and equality in society mean by defund the police?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. So it's when people hear defund the police, I think they initially get a little afraid or apprehensive. The better way to think about it sometimes is divest, invest, right? So if you were to look at the city of Detroit's budget as an example, you're going to see a massive disparity. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I believe for 2019, it was somewhere around $350 million that was put into police departments and public safety, right? With a massive disparity what's put into other departments like neighborhood reform and Black reform and community engagement. When you start talking to somebody about what makes them feel safe, and you say, what does safety mean to you? A lot of people are going to initially start with some very basic things. It means having a roof over your head, right? And consistency in equitable access to housing. It means having job security. It means being able to provide food and clothing for your children. It means being able to know that your kids have equitable access to educational resources. And all of those things contribute to what it means to feel safe. And that's before anybody's ever started talking about crime, right? And I put crime only in quotes because we know as a fact that our current system of policing has a history of criminalizing Black and brown bodies. And so I think we need to be really careful when we start talking about what is or isn't criminal and who defines that standard for us, right? But we as a movement, BLM Detroit as a chapter, the Movement for Black Lives, and if you're not familiar with that, you can go to m4bl.com. It's a coalition, a table of organizations across the country, across the world that are dedicated to equity for Black and brown bodies. When we say defund the police, what we're asking for is more equity in the apportionment of resources and a redefinition of safety. Pull some of that money from riot gear and from the militarization of police and put that towards fair housing practices. Make sure that modern day redlining can't exist. You're seeing the Trump administration roll back Obama era policies that encourage quote unquote, low income housing to be available in different municipalities. And they're speaking in dog whistles to suburban voters, white voters. So roll back some of those policies, divorce funding for public schools from property taxes, and provide our youth with equitable access to educational resources. So the kids in Detroit have the same access as the kids in Farmington or Troy or West Bloomfield. And those are the types of programs that should be necessary. You should not need a group like BLM Detroit. You shouldn't need a group like the NAACP. You shouldn't need a group like Planned Parenthood. And a lot of those resources can come from a reapportionment of funds. And through that reapportionment of funds, I don't know if you've, I'm sure you have, worked up a budget for an organization. People say all the time, budgets are moral documents. If you want to understand an organization, whether it's a municipality or a Fortune 500 company, if you want to understand their ethics, look at how they spend their money. And if you look at how we spend our money as a city, as a county, as a state, then you're going to come away with, in my estimation at least, a pretty dismal understanding of where our ethics lie.
We're speaking with John Sloan. He's the co-lead organizer, Black Lives Matter Detroit. Engaging conversation, fascinating conversation. I'm so glad we have you on. And while we do, just yesterday, we had the Attorney General Barr was in town as part of Operation Legend. I know there's been a lot of talk around the president and him saying he's bringing the feds in. The feds, I will say, have been here for years, but they are getting additional resources. But I would like to get your take on that. And do you think it's needed, or do you think it was just all for show?
Well, so I don't think those two are binary options. I don't think it's needed, but I also don't think it's all for show. I think it is happening and occurring very specifically to reinforce systemically and traditionally racist and biased policies. If we go back a few moments to the conversation we're having around safety, I think it's somewhere around an additional 60 to 70 extra individuals in federal agents, along with millions of dollars in resources. None of those things will affect any of the issues we talked about, right? None of those things will affect fair access to food and water, as an example. None of those things will affect and balance out equitable environmental issues as far as environmental justice and environmental racism. So what's happening is they're addressing, it's fear-mongering to a great extent, and addressing a small portion of what they see as a larger problem. But the part that I think is not necessarily for show is that this is a reinforcement of what we know to be inherently biased policing practices. So if you look at the history of policing in this country, you're going to find, and this is like Reader's Digest, broad strokes. So if there are any history professors out there, I apologize because I'm going to give a lot of information in a short amount of time. You're going to find two general practices that grew up from the North and from the South. And in the North, you're going to find a criminalization of Black bodies. In the South, you're going to find that policing grew out of slave patrols. And that those two philosophies merged during the Great Migration, which generally speaking existed between 1910 to 1970. Right. And the Great Migration was that time period where a lot of Southern Black folk migrated to the North in the aftermath of Jim Crow, looking for jobs and looking to escape what they felt was more overt and oppressive racist practices. So when you saw the merging of those two systems of policing, you saw at the foundation of policing practices in this country, this implicit and inherent bias against Black individuals and against Black bodies. And so what that looks like is if you have a house, as an example, and you know that foundation is cracked, you go to the house and the inspector comes with you and he says, well, listen, the roof is great and the windows are great and you got great hardwood floors, the bathroom was just remodeled, but you got two big massive cracks in the foundation. There's nothing that you can do about that if you don't fix the foundation first. A coat of paint isn't going to fix it. A new roof isn't going to fix it. Right now, we are living in a system where our foundation is cracked. It's inherently cracked. And so it's not broken in the sense that, it went awry somewhere along the path. It's working as it was intended to work, to benefit certain individuals and to oppress others. And so this Operation Legend is a repugnant and disgusting example of how that system is being perpetuated every day to day. And any of our public leaders that speak out in support of that are going to lose the support of me individually, of our organization, and of a lot of Detroiters and I think Michiganders across the state.
John Sloan III with us, the co-lead organizer of Black Lives Matter Detroit. Just another couple minutes with you, John. Before we let you go, I want to get the clarity on what makes the terminology that's often used in response to Black Lives Matter, which is all lives matter. why exactly that term is so offensive and so pervasive and completely against what Black Lives Matter actually means in the real context of the terminology.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So when people say that, if that phrase was just walking around the world 10 years ago, right? If people 10, 15 years ago were just walking around saying, all lives matter, that would be one thing. But that phrase is a direct response and retort to me as an individual standing up and proclaiming that my life has value. Nobody's walking around saying Black Lives Matter more. We're saying Black Lives Matter too. And if you were walking down the street, I'm full of metaphors and imagery today, I apologize. If you're walking down the street and in the neighborhood and you saw one house on fire, and you saw a whole neighborhood pulling together their resources, grabbing their water and their fire extinguishers and running to put out this fire in this house, you're not going to proclaim, hey, wait a minute, save some of that water for me. What happens if my house around the corner catches fire later? You don't see people going to breast cancer awareness events and fundraisers saying, hey, guys, wait a minute, this isn't fair because pancreatic cancer needs our attention too. Our house is on fire. We are burning down. We are being attacked, and we have been attacked for centuries. And so to stand up in my face and to say, well, my life matter, all lives matter, both belies an ignorance to the way this system works and a lack of recognition that this country has not valued my life. This country has not cared for a long time whether I have lived or died. And you're speaking to somebody whose grandfather was Tuskegee Airman, who comes from a family that has fought and bled for this country, and turn around and recognize and realize that this country was not valuing who we were and who we are. And so that phrase, it's hilarious to me in a sort of incredulity that is still being bantied about and tossed around as aggressively as it is. But it is really, really repugnant when you start thinking about from where that sentiment comes. And I have no problem having a conversation with somebody and educating them if they don't have the information or the knowledge. But I think in 2020, to not have the information or the knowledge is a choice and not an accident.
John Sloan, the code lead organizer with Black Lives Matter Detroit, thank you so much for being on the Oakland County MegaCast. I have to tell you, I loved your analogies. I thought they were great today.
This is what happens when you come from a family of teachers. I appreciate it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you for the conversation. We appreciate it.